I don't know if you know this, but the end of the year in the church's calendar and the church's liturgy is not so much January 1st, but actually it's today. Christ the King, the Solemnity of Christ the King. So I guess, Happy New Year. So depending on how you look at it, now is a pretty good time to make New Year's resolutions. And so to give us some guidance in that regard, I thought we might kind of unpack today's gospel. A really famous parable in Jesus' repertoire, Gospel of Matthew chapter 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. So obviously it's emblematic of the final judgment, right? So the people who are included in the kingdom of heaven, they're represented by the sheep, and the ones represented by the goats, they are excluded from the kingdom of heaven. And obviously the main question is, what's the criteria for inclusion versus exclusion? It's kind of surprising, depending on how you look at it. So first of all, focusing on the sheep, what you might expect is that they're included because of membership. So I belong to the holy people of God, or I belong to the Christian community, or maybe a declaration of faith. I believe in Jesus Christ, and based on that declaration of faith, I'm included and I get through the front lines. But that's not the case, right? So it's not based on membership, it's not based on our articulation of faith. They're included because of what they do. In particular, what they do, this thing collectively called the corporal works of mercy. Feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison, and burying the dead. Collectively called, again, the corporal works of mercy. And because they do these things, they're welcomed into the kingdom of heaven. And you put a pause on that and you think about the goats, right? So, interesting to think about the goats. Again, they're excluded from the kingdom of heaven. And why? Not because of some egregious form of evil or violence. So the reason why the goats are excluded from the kingdom of heaven is not because they robbed a bank, or because they killed someone, or because they're guilty of idolatry. They're excluded because of something they did not do. It's very important to remember. We're held accountable for the things that we do, and also the things that we fail to do. And so because of their sins of omission, they can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So they're banished, if you will. So with that, the gospel basically ends. So what I want to do, in light of that, in light of the Solemnity of Christ the King, I want to give you some practical bits of advice as to how to bring to bear the corporal works of mercy. But before I get into that, a couple preliminary remarks. I'm not going to walk through all 7 corporal works of mercy in great detail because there's a lot, and I'm kind of tired. But secondly, I'm going to presume that you're doing something. I'm going to presume that you're doing something for the poor. I'm going to presume you're visiting the sick. I'm going to presume that you're attending funerals occasionally, right? So I'm not going to cover that. So I'm going to cover less obvious practical bits of advice as to how to, again, bring to bear the corporal works of mercy. So the first thing that comes to mind, to recognize that you can actually implement the corporal works of mercy in terms of your immediate circumstances. And we tend to forget that. I don't know about you, but I think a lot of times when we think about the corporal works of mercy, we relegate these things to the someday maybe. Someday, maybe one day in the future, I'll be a missionary in a third world country, and then maybe I'll feed the poor and whatnot, right? Or maybe someday, maybe in the future, when I have less things to do, I'll volunteer. I'll volunteer at the soup kitchen, I'll volunteer at the homeless shelter. But until then, what am I going to do? I can only do so much. To recognize, again, you can actually apply the corporal works of mercy to your immediate circumstances. So let's say, for example, you have young kids. Let's say, for example, you're caring for an elderly parent, right? It's not too hard to imagine you can bring to bear this exhortation to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit the sick, even in a certain sense, visiting those in prison. And so the invitation and the exhortation, in a certain sense, is to kind of maintain and bring to bear a certain supernatural outlook. When you're caring for your kid, when you're caring for your elderly parent, doing something as simple as giving this person something to drink or wiping their forehead, what are you doing? You're not caring simply for this person in time and space. You're actually loving Jesus Christ the Lord in his mystical body. In a certain sense, depending on how you look at it, you're walking in the footsteps of spiritual giants. People like St. Simon of Cyrene, who helps the Lord carry the cross. St. Veronica, who wipes the forehead of Jesus and gives him something to drink. Even someone like St. Mother Teresa, who recognizes Jesus Christ in the poorest of the poor. So again, you're loving Jesus Christ, the King of the universe, in the least of your brethren. Right? So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing that comes to mind, though, is to be creative. To be creative when it comes to bringing to bear the corporal works of mercy. Not just simply as individuals, but especially in a certain sense as groups. There's great power when we come together as a Christian community. And so the example that comes to mind, obviously as a pastor, you get approached by different people, but especially parish groups, asking for permission. Can we do this particular event? Can we do this particular program? And sometimes the conversation is pretty easy and simple, yes or no, right? But I find a lot of times I'm putting it back on the groups, inviting them to kind of respect the process and talk to their groups. And the whole idea is that every age begins anew. So instead of falling back on like what we've always done before, whether we're talking about the past year or the past 10 years, to revisit the thing, right? New problems based on this current age, and therefore new solutions. So every time, but especially now in this post-COVID environment, to kind of ask ourselves certain key core questions. It might sound silly, but it's really important. First of all, like, why does our group even exist? Why does our group even exist? How are we called to make a specific contribution to building up the mystical body of Christ? What do we want? What's our goals? What's our hopes? What's our values? What are our dreams? And then to look at different programs and events. Are these actually appropriate vehicles to match up to the things that we're trying to achieve as a group? And maybe on top of that, to respect good process. Do we actually have good process? Do we approach these issues with prayerful contemplation? Do we even ask the question to the Lord? Lord, what do you want me to do? What do you want us to do with regards to this issue or this problem? And to make sure we have good communication, to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak and share their ideas. And on top of that, to have this complementary sense of gifts and talents. Together, again, we're strong. So the example that comes to mind, let's say, for example, your parish group identifies caring for the poor as a key priority, which is obviously notable, right? To ask yourself questions which, perhaps might seem kind of obvious. First of all, like the way that we're trying to, for example, raise money for the poor, is it actually the best way to raise money? Maybe there's an opportunity to consult local businesses or to kind of bring to bear certain corporate partners. Or to even ask a more fundamental question, who are the poor? And so maybe we give into a certain cause for a period of years, but maybe, again, in this post-COVID world, certain persons, certain categories of persons have emerged which are included in the poor and the needy, and maybe we need to look at them as opposed to exclusively this particular narrow area of what we consider to be the poor. So there's that. Bring a creative approach when it comes to the corporal works of mercy. The final thing, to have this idea of this ongoing approach to the corporal works of mercy. This ongoing approach to the corporal works of mercy. So I'll give you an example. Recently, in collaboration with the parish staff, we were talking to the local homeless shelter in Allison, and just kind of posing them the question, like, okay, what's your most pressing need? That was actually the question. And the response, just to paraphrase, was like, we need food. We need food, like food every day, every week, every month throughout the course of the year. You hear that answer and it sounds kind of obvious, and it's like, yeah, gosh, why didn't I think of that, right? It speaks to the fact that a lot of times when we think about the notion of like hunger or providing food to the poor, we tend to relegate it to some variation of someday maybe, right? Or more specifically, like a seasonal thing. So, okay, now it's Thanksgiving, and now it's Christmas. Oh my gosh, maybe I should provide for the poor. We forget that the poor are human beings like us, and they need to eat actually all throughout the course of the year. And that's the reason, incidentally, why we had that thing in the bulletin, providing for the local homeless shelter. And to your credit, actually, people have really stepped up. To the point at which we were actually going to have a representative from Shift, the local homeless shelter, make a pitch from the pulpit, but they said, you know what, we're actually good because the community has really stepped up. So thank you very much for that. But in a broader sense, it speaks to two particular categories when it comes to the corporal works of mercy, right? So welcoming the stranger, but also visiting those in prison. When you think about those two categories, you might think, okay, well, they refer specifically to immigrants. They refer specifically to people who are locked away in prison, and certainly so. But if you think about it in a broader sense, these two things refer to people who have no friends. No friends, no family, no sense of community. And so you pause on that, okay, what do they need? They need a sense of belonging, a sense of accompaniment, a sense of journeying with, which by its very definition is not a one-off thing, but an ongoing thing. One final example, and with this. And so recently I was listening to a story by Sister Miriam James Heidland, this nun who was reflecting on her own life. In particular, she was reflecting on the fact that back in the day, she realized that she had a lot of issues stemming from a certain woundedness and abuse that she sustained over a period of time in childhood. And the way she tells the story is that these memories, these experiences were so painful that initially she couldn't even speak to a therapist in terms of a one-on-one relationship over the phone or certainly not in person. All they could do was email. And the way she tells the story is that every time I sent that email, I would think to myself, this is going to be the day. This is going to be the day when my therapist says to me, you know what, you're crazy, and you're gross, and you're disgusting, and I can't believe you're a nun. I don't want to talk to you anymore. And every time she sent that email, she was bracing for that moment. But the way she phrases it is that day never came. That day never came. But instead, in the midst of our correspondence, the therapist would always put down all these lies that was telling myself about my self-worth and always affirm my sense of goodness back then, but especially now. And that's the thing that was healing. That's the thing that was redemptive. And I love that story because it really helps to bring together these things we're talking about today. We all know intuitively that the world is meant to know us based on the quality of our love. But you think it through in light of everything we're talking about today, that love can't simply be being nice or being polite or being kind. It has to have a certain substance and quality. Christian love is meant to be specific, concrete, mindful of both body and soul, inspirational, prophetic, intensely personal. Because we're not just loving the poorest of the poor, we're actually loving Jesus Christ, King of the universe, in the mystical body of Christ.